All right, so get ready for a deep dive into a case that will leave you with more questions than answers. We're talking about the death of George Torres Jr.
Found zipped inside a suitcase.
Yeah, in his Orlando, Florida apartment.
Back in February of 2020.
2020.
What's fascinating here is that his girlfriend, Sarah Boone, is the one who called 911, claiming it was a tragic accident during a game of hide-and-seek gone wrong.
Hide and seek in a suitcase.
But as we'll uncover, the story's far more complicated than that.
Way more complicated.
Yeah.
We've got a treasure trove of sources to sift through for you guys. The original 911 call, police body cam footage from the scene, and even recordings of Sarah's interrogation.
Oh, wow.
Our mission is to retrace the steps of this investigation and try to make sense of what happened. Was this truly an accident, or is there something more sinister at play?
Let's begin with that 911 call, because it gives us our first glimpse into Sarah's version of events. You could actually hear in her voice how she tries to downplay the situation, almost like she's in shock, but there's an unsettling casualness to it.
Yeah, let's play a snippet of that call. I have to warn you, it's pretty disturbing.
Okay.
It's like she's talking about a lost dog or a broken vase. That detachment is just eerie, especially given that she's describing her boyfriend's death. It immediately raises red flags, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the police body cam footage from when they arrive at the scene only deepens the mystery. We see Sarah. And oddly enough, her ex-husband is there too.
Oh, wow.
Not exactly what you'd expect during a fun night with your current boyfriend.
Not at all. That's one of the first inconsistencies that jumps out. And Sarah keeps painting this picture of a normal evening, drinking wine, doing puzzles, and then this hide-and-seek game. She even repeats several times how much she loved George and that they were having a good day.
But it's like she's trying too hard to convince them, and maybe even herself, that everything was fine, almost as if she's already constructing a defense. Then there's the detail about blaming the wine for what happened almost immediately, which feels like a very deliberate attempt to deflect responsibility.
Right, like she's setting the stage for an "I wasn't in my right mind" argument. Now, fast forward to the interrogation room where, at first, Sarah appears surprisingly calm and collected.
Okay.
She even came prepared with a list of questions for the detective.
Wow.
But that facade quickly crumbles when he drops a bombshell.
This is where the case takes a dramatic turn.
Here's the audio of that moment.
Okay.
I get chills every time I hear that. You can practically hear the color draining from her face. It's like she's instantly realizing that her carefully constructed narrative is about to fall apart.
It's a classic example of how a single piece of evidence can completely derail a suspect's story. Up until that point, she was in control. But the videos change everything.
She goes from composed to panicked in a matter of seconds. It's almost like she's experiencing the gravity of the situation for the first time. The detective really throws her off balance.
And what's interesting is how she responds to being confronted with the videos. First, it's that she claims she doesn't remember recording them at all, which is a common defense mechanism when faced with incriminating evidence. Then she tries to downplay their significance. And of course, she brings up the alcohol again as a way to explain away her actions.
But these aren't just any videos. They reveal a side of the story that's completely at odds with the fun night Sarah initially described. What we see and hear is truly horrifying.
We need to prepare you for this because these videos are very disturbing.
In the first video, time-stamped 11/2012 p.m., we see George trapped inside the suitcase, desperately pleading with Sarah to let him out. He repeatedly says he can't breathe and begs for air.
And Sarah, she's mocking him.
Yeah.
There are even moments where she taunts him with phrases like, "for everything you've done to me," which implies a motive of retaliation or revenge.
It's absolutely bone-chilling. It's almost impossible to reconcile this image of a terrified man struggling to breathe with Sarah's earlier portrayal of a playful game gone wrong.
And about 11 minutes later, there's another video. The suitcase has been moved and flipped over. But George is still inside, still begging to be let out.
And her response is just unimaginable. She actually tells him, "That's what you get for cheating on me." It's like she's punishing him, playing a sick game of power and control.
The contrast between what we see and hear in these videos and the version of events Sarah initially presented is just staggering. The detective picks up on this immediately and starts using those inconsistencies to dismantle her story piece by piece.
It's like watching a house of cards collapse. But Sarah isn't giving up just yet. Even with the evidence staring her in the face, she keeps insisting that this was all an accident.
And this is where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll examine Sarah's explanations, her attempts to shift blame, and the detective's strategy for getting to the truth. Stay with us because This case is about to get even more complicated.
So we left off with Sarah Boone confronted with those horrifying videos.
Yeah.
And yet still clinging to the idea that George's death was a tragic accident. But the interrogation is far from over, and the detective continues to press her for answers.
It's fascinating to observe his approach because he doesn't just focus on the inconsistencies in Sarah's story. He also uses a variety of psychological tactics to try to break through her defenses. For example, he repeatedly brings up the fact that George's head was near the zipper of the suitcase, suggesting that there must have been some sound, some indication that he was desperately trying to get out.
And he even asks her to imagine herself trapped in the suitcase, begging for air, trying to appeal to her empathy and force her to confront the reality of what George experienced. It's a powerful technique, and you can see it starting to chip away at her composure.
Yeah.
Yet Sarah remains fixated on this narrative that she didn't intend for any of this to happen.
Right.
She keeps repeating phrases like, "My plan wasn't to leave him in there," and "I didn't mean for this to happen," as if those words alone could absolve her of responsibility.
It's almost like she can't or won't process the severity of the situation, even with the evidence right there in front of her. It's as if she's trapped in this mental loop of denial.
And that's where the alcohol comes back into play.
Yeah.
Sarah repeatedly blames the wine, claiming that it impaired her judgment and memory. She's essentially arguing that she wasn't in control of her actions, which is a common defense strategy in cases involving intoxication.
Of course.
But the detective pushes back, arguing that even under the influence of alcohol, she had to have some awareness of what was happening.
Right.
He points to the fact that she physically moved the suitcase multiple times, which suggests a level of consciousness and deliberation that contradicts her claims of being completely blackout drunk.
He's meticulously dismantling her defense, piece by piece, forcing her to confront the fact that her actions, regardless of her intent, directly led to George's death. What's fascinating is how, despite the mounting evidence against her, Sarah seems to almost retreat further into the state of denial and deflection.
And then there's that strange moment where she becomes completely fixated on the male detective's phone, convinced that he's texting someone about her. She even asks to see his phone, accusing him of laughing at her situation.
It's such a jarring shift in focus, and frankly, it comes across as a bit bizarre given the gravity of the interrogation. You could argue that it's a sign of her unraveling under pressure, or even a desperate attempt to divert attention away from the videos and her own incriminating actions.
It definitely makes you question her state of mind at that point. And that's when the detective delivers what feels like the final blow. He looks directly at Sarah and says, "You realize you're the person that killed him, right?"
It's such a blunt, stark statement, and you can almost feel the air leave the room. It's the moment that finally seems to penetrate Sarah's wall of denial.
She completely breaks down, sobbing uncontrollably, but still clinging to the idea that it wasn't intentional. But the detective has heard enough. He tells her to stand up and informs her that she's under arrest for the murder of George Torres Jr.
And Sarah's reaction is a mix of shock and disbelief. She keeps repeating, "Why is this happening?" as if she can't comprehend that she's being held responsible for George's death. Even as they're putting her in handcuffs, she seems completely bewildered by the outcome.
It's a powerful moment that underscores the vast chasm between Sarah's perception of events and the harsh reality of the situation. She's been charged with second-degree murder, which, for our listeners who may not be familiar with legal terms, means that the killing was intentional but not premeditated.
It's important to clarify here that intent doesn't necessarily mean that she planned to kill George, but rather that her actions were deliberate and consciously reckless, leading to his death. The prosecution will have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Sarah understood the potential consequences of her actions when she zipped George into that suitcase.
And that brings us to another intriguing layer of this case. Sarah is being held without bond, which means the judge believes she poses a flight risk or a danger to the community. This is fairly unusual in cases like this, especially given that she has no prior criminal record.
It suggests that the judge has serious concerns about the strength of the evidence against Sarah. And it becomes even more complicated when you factor in that 6 lawyers have already quit representing her, each citing irreconcilable differences as their reason for withdrawing from the case.
That detail is incredibly telling. It's not every day that you hear about 6 lawyers walking away from a case. What could be so challenging about this case that would make experienced attorneys abandon their client?
It suggests they may have struggled to reconcile the evidence with a plausible defense strategy. The videos, in particular, are incredibly damning. Imagine trying to convince a jury that locking someone in a suitcase, even as a drunken prank, is anything but reckless and dangerous, especially considering George's repeated pleas for help.
Plus, there's the fact that Sarah herself brought up past incidents of domestic violence in both the body cam footage and the interrogation. Could this be a potential angle for her defense? Could she argue that this was a case of self-defense gone wrong?
That's certainly a possibility, and it's something we need to explore further. The restraining order that Sarah filed against George is a significant piece of the puzzle. What evidence supports her claims of abuse? Was George truly a threat to her safety? And if so, could her actions that night be interpreted as a desperate attempt to protect herself from further harm?
These are all questions that the jury will have to grapple with. It's a tangled web of conflicting narratives and disturbing evidence, and the truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in the shadows between those accounts.
We're going to take a closer look at the domestic violence aspect of this case in part 3 of our deep dive, along with possible defense strategies and the potential legal ramifications of Sarah's actions. We'll also examine the role of alcohol in this tragic event and whether it can truly be used as an excuse for such reckless behavior.
So we've examined the chilling details of this case, from Sarah Boone's initial 911 call to the shocking videos that contradicted her story. Now we have to try to understand the complexities of the legal battle that lies ahead and the role that domestic violence might play in her defense.
This is where things get really interesting, because it's not just about proving whether or not Sarah intended to kill George. It's about understanding the context of their relationship and whether any history of abuse could be used to justify her actions.
Right, and we know that Sarah filed a restraining order against George at some point, which suggests that there was a pattern of conflict and potentially violence in their relationship. But what does that restraining order actually tell us?
Well, restraining orders are typically issued when a court finds that there's a credible threat of harm. To obtain one, Sarah would have had to present evidence of abuse, which could include police reports, medical records, or witness testimonies.
So if there's documented evidence of abuse, could that be enough to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors? Could they see Sarah's actions as a desperate act of self-defense, even if it resulted in a tragic and disproportionate outcome?
It's certainly a possibility, but it's a risky strategy. The defense would have to convince the jury that Sarah genuinely feared for her life in that moment, that she believed George posed an imminent threat to her safety.
But wouldn't the videos work against that argument? I mean, she's laughing, taunting him. It's hard to reconcile those actions with someone who's genuinely afraid for their life.
Exactly. That's the challenge. The prosecution will likely argue that Sarah's behavior in the videos demonstrates a lack of fear and instead points towards malice or even a desire for revenge. They'll highlight the fact that she mocked George, blamed him for cheating, and didn't appear to show any remorse until she was confronted with the evidence.
So how could the defense possibly overcome that?
They might try to argue that Sarah's reaction was a delayed response to trauma, a sort of emotional shock that manifested as inappropriate laughter or callousness. They might call in expert witnesses to testify about the psychological effects of domestic abuse and how victims can sometimes react in unpredictable ways.
It sounds like they would need to build a very compelling case to make that argument believable. But even if they can convince the jury that Sarah was a victim of abuse, would that be enough to justify her actions?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The law recognizes self-defense as a justifiable reason for using force, but it has to be proportionate to the threat. The jury would have to believe that Sarah genuinely felt that her life was in danger and that zipping George into a suitcase was her only option for protecting herself.
And that's where the alcohol becomes a factor, right? Because Sarah consistently claims that she was heavily intoxicated and that her memory of the events is hazy. Could that play a role in the jury's decision?
Absolutely. Intoxication can be a mitigating factor in criminal cases because it can impair judgment and reduce a person's ability to form intent. The defense could argue that Sarah's actions were not a deliberate act of murder, but rather a series of terrible decisions fueled by alcohol and a history of trauma.
But then again, wouldn't the prosecution argue that if she was sober enough to operate her phone to move the suitcase and to respond to George's pleas, then she was certainly aware of the consequences of her actions?
Precisely. It's a delicate balancing act for both sides. The prosecution will likely emphasize the deliberate nature of Sarah's actions, while the defense will try to paint a picture of a woman who was acting impulsively under the influence of alcohol and past trauma.
It's a fascinating legal dilemma with no easy answers. We've got conflicting narratives, disturbing evidence, and a complex web of legal arguments to untangle. So What can our listeners take away from this deep dive? What should they be thinking about as this case unfolds?
I think the biggest takeaway here is that this case forces us to confront the gray areas of human behavior and the limits of the legal system. There's no neat and tidy resolution, no simple explanation for what happened that night. We're left with a profound sense of unease and a reminder that the truth is often far more complicated than it initially appears.
And it raises so many questions about the nature of intent, the impact of alcohol on decision-making, and the role of past trauma in shaping our actions. It also challenges us to consider the complexities of domestic violence and how it can manifest in unexpected ways.
And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this. Even if Sarah Boone didn't intend to kill George Torres Jr., does that absolve her of responsibility for his death? Can we truly separate intent from consequence in a case as tragic and disturbing as this?
It's a question that will likely be debated in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion for a long time to come. And it's a question that each of us, as listeners, must grapple with as we try to make sense of this perplexing and ultimately heartbreaking case. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.